Morning, this is a response to a video by Laura Layla called Love Labours to Beget, and the title there, Love Labours to Beget, is a line from a John Donne poem called The Ecstasy, which you, Laura Layla, have kindly linked to, so I've had a look at that. One of the things that jumps out at me about that really is, and this is only kind of tangentially related to what you're talking about, which I will come on to, was this phrase, I-beam. It describes two lovers lying possibly on the bank of a river, but they may actually be in bed, who knows. But and they're kind of at the beginning of the poem, they're only connected by one person. They're holding each other's hands, and their eye beams are intertwined, he says, or some words to that effect. And then later on, they're more intimately connected via their souls or something, but their bodies more specifically. But as I said at the beginning, it's their hands and their eye beams, which I think is fascinating. One is this, one is the fact that it's their hands. You know, the touch is really significant there. You know, and touch is that sense which kind of precedes us into the world in a way, but most intimately linked to our bodies. You know, our hands are the things that reach forward and, you know, grasp doorknobs and push things out of the way and pull ourselves forward and things. So, you know, so touch is always about, at least to me, a kind of process out into the world. And the fact that it's, in this particular poem, it's the meeting of one hand with another. It's that moment when touch meets touch. So it's both a reaching out and, obviously a connection. With that point of contact. You know, because obviously if I just touch this table here, yeah, that feeling of touch that I'm getting is my point of contact as an animate being with an inanimate object, kind of. But of course, if I'm touching someone's hand, or if two hands are touching one another, then that point of contact, that touch, is one self meeting another self. It's two beings with that touch being mutually felt, mutually arising as the point of being between two what would otherwise be separate beings, because being and sensing, and particularly something like being and touch, I think, are really closely allied concepts. So there's that, and then there's the I-beam thing, which I really like. You know, this it's interesting. It jumped out at me. The reason why it jumped out at me, incidentally, is because in a video I made a couple of days ago about time, I quoted a T.S. Eliot poem, Burnt Norton from the Four Quartets, in which he uses the same phrase, our unseen eye beams crossed, he says, which is this idea that, I mean, it's not real in any sense, but this sense that used to be the case, that it was felt that the eyes, that looking, a bit like touching, was a projecting out. So when you saw something, when you looked at something, a beam kind of left the eye and contacted the world, in the way that radar might, like a sonar in a bat. You know, something is leaving the organism and then coming back from the world to report on what it's found. And there's older understandings of how vision worked are a bit like that the eye sent out beams. Of course, we know it's not true now, but it still has a kind of poetic resonance for us. And I think still in the way we think about vision, it's sometimes like that we still do probe the world with our eyes, as if there's some intention, some active principle at work going out. And of course, when those eyes meet the eyes of another person, as these do in the John Donne poem, The Ecstasy, there's a sense of that ecstatic motion out. Not only the ecstatic motion of the hand, which finds its echo in the similar ecstatic motion of another hand, and the point of contact being the point of mutual being, but the same thing is happening at the level of the eye. These eye beams intertwining, with the point of contact being this area of mutual being, which Donne goes on to talk about, as you know, in that poem, where he talks about the souls, the spirits of these people. We might call it mind or intellect or feeling or sentience or something like that now, but either way, these kind of soul spirits as occupying this mid-space between them, presumably the space where hand meets hand to form being, where eye meets eye to form being, and then later we assume other kinds of intimate contact take place, with the point of contact mutually arising as a point of mutual being, which I really like. Now that's a long preamble into why I like the video, But it got me thinking about several things, because part of the metaphor that's kind of, for me, it is being played out there is a begetting, in sense of a giving, not exactly giving birth to, but a giving form to some kind of offspring, some kind of output is being generated, a pushing forward, an ecstatic, pushing into the world, via the sense of touch or the sense of sight, and then the other bodily senses following. So there's that kind of begetting. But also later on in the video you talk about transport and motion and movement. And again, this kind of dynamic sense. And in Donne, he kind of makes that distinction, doesn't he? He describes the bodies of the two lovers lying on the riverbank, looking into each other's eyes. He describes these bodies, for a while at least, as sepulchral, with the spirits that lie between them, the being that emerges at their points of contact, as being the kind of dynamic element. But then he goes on to elaborate that and brings the bodies back into the loop. So it's the bodies which are dynamic, generating and forcing forward, and that forcing forward being this sense of mutual movement, which is creating this mutual sense of being. So it's a really dynamic process. So as I say, even though he describes them as being sepulchral at one point, as if these are two corpses, two inanimate objects, out of which is emerging this spirit, as I say, he brings them back into the loop, so the bodies themselves are part of the generative process. They're part of the process by which the becoming of this conjoined, intertwined, interwoven being is generated. But that got me thinking about being and becoming, which I've made a video about ages ago, and which I've thought about quite a bit. This difference between being and becoming. Because when we talk about being, even though being is a verb, it's an action, it's a dynamic sense, we don't think of it like that a lot of the time, do we? We tend to think about beings, human beings, as kind of objects in the world, like tabletops and wristwatches and laptop computers and cameras. These objects. But they're not, are they? I mean, they are quite literally constantly in actions of becoming. We're more like fountains than we are like statues. There's a constant flow, literally, of the material objects and material substance of the world through us. The food is constantly turning into us. The air is constantly turning into us, we're in this constant process of physical becoming, but also our sense of who we are is constantly being generated in a completely intimate, monadistic, singular process with that physical stuff. That the information pattern that is who I seem to be is constantly being regenerated each moment. Each moment gives another step forward, another act of motion, another movement in this kind of transport of delight that is our, and other things, not just delight, that is our bodies, generating us on the fly constantly, and generating us in relation to one another and in relation to the inanimate objects of the world. So the inanimate objects are constantly crumbling to dust and being absorbed into us and becoming us, and then there we are in contact with the inanimate objects and the animate objects of one another and the other animals, with our being emerging at points of contact, not only with the inanimate objects, but at the points of contact we have with one another in these elegiac moments that Donne describes. At the moment where not just our eye beams cross, but the eye of our eyes cross. I don't mean you cross your eyes, that wouldn't be sensible at all. But yeah, so this being and becoming, but this being and becoming is also a begetting, isn't it? That's what I think. So you get this being, becoming, begetting, where yes, we are beings, which is our body, and then we have this sense of becoming. So we're constantly emerging out of the moments of our history. Constantly, here I am, alive and awake. Now I am really awake, now I am really awake. That's constantly happening. But we're also the ground on which the next moment of our existence is being begotten. Yeah? We constantly beget the next moment of our existence in all its forms. In the form of its flesh, but also in the form of its thoughts and feelings, and particularly its expressions. You know, we are expressed like toothpaste from a tube into the future, like a hand reaching forward into the darkness, or like an eye beam, you know, crossing space. You know, where we are in this act, it seems to me, of that begetting, giving birth to begetting, becoming, in turn giving birth to begetting. And sometimes those begettings are fecund. Sometimes they open out, don't they? You know, that the next moment of our lives opens out, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the next moment of our lives that we are begetting from our sense of being and becoming, sometimes those moments just kind of fall stillborn onto the world, don't they? And we have to kind of retreat a little bit, or they feel like they're just thrown against a wall, you know, and nobody responds to our videos, or we just feel like we're pissing in the wind. And then we come back to ourselves. And those are the most depressing moments often, aren't they? When we don't feel like we're being creative, and I don't just mean in any kind of artistic or scientific or technical sense, but we just don't feel like we're going anywhere. We don't feel like we're creating our futures. We don't feel like we've become properly, and we certainly don't feel like we're begetting anything. I'm just begetting nowhere, we might say. But other times, you know, we do. Other times that feeling of a flow from being through to becoming to begetting, and we're all parts of that. You know, when we're, I think, at our best, we feel like we're parts of that. You know, we're not spinning our wheels. We're not up against the wall. We're not throwing dead, stillborn versions of oneself into the future. We're not locked in stasis. We are genuinely ecstasis. We're genuinely joining the ecstatic ecstasy of communication, of communion, of being together, you know, with one another and with the world. And that's when it's kind of working, it seems to me, as my eye beams shoot out from my face into the lens of this camera.